Hello world! Here in the United Kingdom we have laid our monarch, the late Majesty the Queen, to rest. Indeed, may the family be comforted at this moment in time. I appreciate that royalty is not everybody's cup of tea, but I do want to just take a little bit of time to just express my appreciation and admiration for many of the things that Her Majesty, Her late Majesty, displayed, which are values which are important to me, values which my own parents instilled in us as a family, values such as dedication to duty and hard work. They always used to share a Bible text: whatever your hands find to do, do it with all your might. I do believe Her Majesty did serve with all of her might over the 7 decades which she did her job. I do appreciate the fact that she was a very strong figure who seemed to hold a lot together. The royal family is not immune from everyday life. Indeed, the grief they feel is not royal grief, it's human grief. They go through human suffering, human pain, and many things that human beings go through. But we admire the fact that behind the scenes there seemed to be somebody who was a stabilizing force holding it all together, and somebody who understood discretion, when to say, when not to say. I also appreciate the fact that she signed her letters "Your Servant," regardless of status, station, accolades, qualification. We're all here to serve, and she's a person after my own heart, because apparently when people went to dinner with the Queen or to tea with the Queen, she would be the one to get the gloves on and do the washing up by hand, apparently, of her own dishes. She liked to wash her own dishes by hand. So for those who think you're too high and mighty to wash the dishes, if it's good enough for the Queen, then go and find your dishwashing gloves and get on with it. I remember watching a documentary a couple of weeks ago about the things that she got involved with, and she was the patron of the Women's Institute, a very important organization actually in the abolitionist movement, the abolition of the slave trade in Britain. One of the strong, powerful voices was actually the Women's Institute, and she would go there on a yearly basis for their annual dinner. And one of the interviewees from the Women's Institute said she would actually come and sit at the table with them, not just shake hands and leave, but she would stick around for like 3 hours at the table, pouring tea for them and sharing food and sandwiches and cakes and so forth. And she loved it when they did their yearly amateur dramatics, when they did their yearly play. She would, be in fits of laughter and calling out and so forth. And I think it's great that she got engaged and spent quality time with people, so I like that. But I want to share some stories. It's been my privilege with my various choirs to have performed in the presence of royalty and the presence of Her Majesty on several occasions, quite a number of occasions. And following a number of those occasions, in fact, on 5 occasions I've actually been presented to the Queen and have shaken their hands and had the opportunity to have a little bit of a small talk with her. And she's somebody who mastered small talk. I recall where she would talk and she would be interested in the process. So I remember when I met her after the reopening of the Royal Festival Hall, she was quite interested in the process of how we got it all together, how we rehearsed, how long did it take us to rehearse, etc. So I remember her being quite interested in that process. Maybe she wanted to join the choir as an alto or something like that. Apparently she would be somebody who could have met you 3 or 4 years later and recalled that conversation, and she was that sharp in her mind. So I recall that little 2 sentences we had where she was actually quite interested in how long did it take us to get it all together. And then another incident I remember was where we performed at the Golden Jubilee in 2002, and my choir performed at the Prom at the Palace, which is a special concert which took place in the palace grounds. Audience of 12,000 and 200 plus million worldwide. They had a pop concert and a classical concert, and I recall after, when we met her, she had this broad, genuine smile. It's a smile which said, "I'm so elated by what happened here this evening, I'm so happy." She just looked so relaxed. It wasn't, "Here's a smile I made earlier, I need to smile because I'm supposed to." She really was just full of joy, and I always remember that. So she just looks really relaxed and just so happy tonight. So that smile would always be something that I remember. And here is a picture. We had the joy of going into the palace afterwards and hanging out with her children and conversing. It was almost surreal that you're there with the royal family just having normal conversation. And then a couple of funny stories before I sign off. Here's another picture. This was taken same year, the Jubilee year, but this was an event done by her husband, the late His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. And this was an environment interfaith service that the choir sang at, and this is where we met afterwards. But I do recall the interaction she had with her husband, and it was always wonderful to watch. But I remember an event that one of my choirs, Croydon Gospel Choir, was singing at, and it was in Westminster Abbey. And the royals who were there at the time proceeded up the aisle. So they went up the aisle, and then they stopped halfway. Everything just stopped. The procession stopped halfway, and it stopped right in front of where we were as a choir. So we had full sight and full hearing of when the Duke of Edinburgh, who spoke his mind, he spoke his mind as he thought it, he said it, and wasn't necessarily known for discretion, but he could be witty. And here we are in Westminster Abbey. Of course it's an abbey, the Queen's just arrived, so everybody's on their best behaviour, everything's quiet, and he says audibly, he says, "Well, what's happened? Have we come to some traffic lights or something?" Everybody gave a muted laugh. But the Queen had this straight look on her face when he when he blurted out. But having said that, if you were under the impression that when they got home she gave him a slap on the wrist and a reprimand and said, "You really must have more decorum in public," she probably went home and laughed with him, because she was somebody who saw the funny side of things and did have a sense of humour. But I think my favourite story is when I was first introduced to the Queen. This was following a performance at Westminster Abbey again for a Commonwealth Observance Day service. This is where heads of state come and the Queen herself comes. The late Queen herself comes. Well, she doesn't come late, but you know what I mean. And I was part of the lineup, and she has an aide next to her who says, "Your Majesty, this is such and such a person who did this, and this is such a person who did that." So it came to me and said, "This is Ken Burton, he was the conductor of the choir." And as you can see, we are similar heights. But anyway, she looked up to me and says, "You have a very lovely choir, very good volume." The Queen's expression, you heard it from her mouth. Musicians, whenever something's nice and loud, we can say, "Very good volume." So those were some fond memories I've had of meeting the Queen in person and performing for her on a number of occasions. So at this time, as we reflect on her life, then I want to wish everybody all the very best, and God save the King.